Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us at the Economic Research Council, and welcome to today's session. My name is Jax Mallander. I'm on the Executive Committee of the ERC, and it's my privilege to introduce Professor Malcolm Prowle to talk to us this evening. We're really glad he could join us here today. He's a Professor of Performance Management at the Nottingham Business School and Gloucestershire Business School. And he started his career before he worked in academia as a scientist, and then transitioned into a career in economics and finance, which is actually where I met Malcolm. We were working out earlier this evening that it was about 35 years ago, which is a little bit scary. And with that sort of eclectic past, he's got a lot of experience, I guess, in advising government on a whole range of different policy issues. And most recently, including environmental sustainability. And his latest book, Global Climate Change, A Realistic View of the Future, discusses the drastic measures we need to curb global warming. And so he's going to give us a little bit of a talk about the main sort of arguments within the book. He's going to talk for about 35 minutes or so, and then we're going to open up for Q&A. So if you'd like to put your questions into the Q&A function that's available on the Zoom call, please do. I'm going to have a look at those questions when Malcolm's finished speaking and pass them on to him. And so on that note, with great anticipation, I welcome Malcolm to share his valuable insights. Over to you, Malcolm.
Okay, thanks very much, Jack. Right, good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming tonight. Saying to David just now, I think when the date for this event was fixed, we never dreamed it would be in the middle of a general election campaign. But having said that, from what I've seen so far, although climate change is obviously a huge problem, it's often referred to as one of the biggest challenges humanity's ever faced. Nothing much seems to be happening on the political front. Very few people seem to talk about climate change, it seems to me. They talk about a lot of other things. What I'd like to do, I'm going to try and share my screen and hope it works. We did practice it just now, so it should be okay.
Yep, that's working.
That's okay, is it? So
yeah.
Yeah, okay. Right, so you can see my title there then, Where Now for UK Climate Change. I particularly want to focus towards the end on the issue about mitigation and adaptation. If you're not clear about the difference in the terms, I'll certainly cover that. And particularly how we pay for them, how we finance them. Perhaps just start, first of all, how I got interested in climate change. Now, I always say I'm not somebody like King Charles or David Bellamy or David Attenborough, who have been talking about climate change for decades, as long as I can remember. I came to it very much late on. It's only something I've been interested in perhaps, 5 to 10 years, something like that. And I think the reasons were that I sort of came to the conclusion there were a number of themes about climate change which were important. One is obviously the science behind climate change. The second one is the economic impacts of climate change. And the third one is the politics of it. And I always say that climate change fundamentally at the end of the day is not a scientific issue. The science is very important. It underpins everything, but fundamentally it's a political issue. Now, it so happened, and I didn't want to spend a lot of time talking about me and what jobs I did, but I just wanted to pick up something Jack said, that originally I studied science at university, chemistry and physics. I graduated in chemistry, and I've had an ongoing interest in scientific development. So I think I have a reasonable understanding of the science, the chemistry and physics of climate change. In public policy and finance, I became professionally qualified accountant, post-grad work. I worked in a variety of different public services, in financial roles, local government, health, education, central government. And for about 20 years, I worked with two of the big consulting firms, KPMG and PwC, which is where Jack and I met. Been seconded to several Whitehall departments and academic experience, a few other things. So that's that one. Third one is political. I actually come from a politically active family. Both my father and my grandfather were politicians, elected politicians. My daughter works for the shadow cabinet minister. She's hoping to be in government in a few weeks' time. We'll have to see what happens there. I've been an advisor to 3 shadow ministers and an advisor to a couple of House of Commons select committees, the health one and the public administration one. So that's something about me. What I want to cover in this session is 3 things, really. One is just something about the nature of climate change. Now, many of you may have a good knowledge of this. Many of you may have a better knowledge than me. I don't know, but it's important just to cover this, to talk about some of the climate change actions that are taking place or should be taking place, and what are the associated costs. And the third bit which I've touched on is financing it. How are we going to pay for this? Because you'll come on to in a minute. We're talking about substantial amounts of money here. So I'll just off with the nature of climate change, and I'll just put this graph up, which I think is illustrative. This is showing the trends in the surface temperature of the Earth over the last 170 years or so, something like that. I mean, before 1850, we have no measures because thermometers hadn't been invented by that time. But from that period, we started to have some reasonably good measurements. And you can see, there's lots of ups and downs and bumps, but you can see generally over that 170-year period, the trend of the surface temperature of the Earth is upward. There are 3 data sources here. 2 of them are American, one is British, and you can see they all pretty much map onto one another. They're very, very similar trends. And little who notes at the bottom, I just note the steep rise in the final decade of the 20th century and the 21st century. So the Earth is warming. There are other measures other than just surface temperature. We get a similar picture from the temperature in the oceans, the temperature in different parts of the atmosphere, all point in the same direction. The Earth is warming. That brings together a number of things. Global warming. Obviously, global warming is one of the major drivers of climate change, but there are other factors I just want to note which are important, and they're all linked. The loss of biodiversity around the planet. We are losing thousands of millions of species, over a period of years. And we're not talking so much about furry animals or anything like that here. We're thinking about things like insects, bacteria, those sorts of things. Things that are important for habitat, the health of habitats. We're looking at habitat destruction, both in terms of animals and plants. And we're looking at non-renewable resources. There are resources, natural resources in the world. Some of them are renewable. Water is an example. Water evaporates into the atmosphere and comes back down in rain. It goes around in a circle. Other resources are non-renewable, and we are using them up. The one I like to quote is helium gas. Helium gas, the reserves on the Earth are finite, and it has a lot of uses in things like medical technology and IT, but we're using a lot of it to fill party balloons for kids to have. We're wasting those natural resources. So all of these things are linked. I haven't got time to go into this, but they're all interrelated between one another. Main causes of global warming. Well, what I'm showing here is what we have is a situation where the sun releases radiation, ultraviolet radiation, travels all directions. It reaches Earth. Most of it, thankfully, is blocked by the atmosphere because obviously it is carcinogenic, but a lot of it passes through the atmosphere down to the Earth's surface. That heat is then radiated back outwards from the Earth into space in the form of infrared radiation. Now, if the heat coming in, if the radiation coming in and the radiation going out balance, then we don't have a problem. The temperature of the Earth is pretty stable. But what we find is that's not happening. What we have seeing now is what's often referred to as a blanket around the Earth. It's a layer of greenhouse gas emissions, and the greenhouse gases are things like carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, water vapor. And this blanket is stopping some of the heat from leaving the Earth. It's still coming in, from the atmosphere from the sun, but it's not leaving the Earth in the same sort of quantity. So the temperature on the Earth is rising. That's the main reason for global warming. Now, the IPC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which I'm sure you've heard of, the people who organize the COP summits, the 28 COP summits, they have two what I've called totemic objectives. Everybody hears about them. We know about them. One of these is to have net zero. This means that we will achieve net zero emissions of greenhouse gases by 2050. Now, net zero means whatever we put into the atmosphere in terms of greenhouse gases, we take out the same amount a variety of ways, carbon capture and these sorts of things. So to achieve net zero by 2050, we want to get to that state of net zero emissions. The second one is that we want to contain the rise in the average temperature, surface temperature of the Earth, to 2 degrees centigrade, or preferably 1.5 degrees centigrade. Now, the reason is that, well, 1.5 is probably not going to be achieved, as I'll come on to later on, but it's much better if we can achieve 1.5 than 2. Things are going to happen at 1.5 degrees. They're going to be even worse. Even though there's half a degree difference, there's a big difference in the impact between 1.5 and 2 degrees C. Now, people often ask, what is the 1.5 degrees related to? Well, it's related to what the temperature was pre-industrialization. So this is looking at the period 1850 to 1900, when the Industrial Revolution started to take off. It's looking at trying to contain temperature rises by 1.5 degrees from that particular time. And climate change impacts, well, I think we know about these current ones. We've seen record high temperatures, low temperatures, rising seas temperatures, all of those sorts of things. Ocean acidification is an interesting one, because that is having an impact on the coral reefs. It's the carbon dioxide is dissolving in the sea and becoming acid, and it's damaging the coral reefs. And in the future, there are other things as well. Continuation of things are happening now. Desertification of land, but in a much greater state. Coastal flooding. I was talking just now about, there's a little village in Wales where I'm from called Fairborn, and that they reckon that will be flooded by 2050, and other places in the UK as well. Famine, drought, war, mass migration is one which I'll come back to, which I think is really, really important. Did quite a bit of research for the book that Jack referred to, where I went through the data and I pulled out the carbon emissions, greenhouse gas emissions of various countries. And these countries shown there are what I call the top 10 polluting countries. These are the biggest polluters in the world. Out of the 197 countries, I think, in the world, these are the 10 most polluting countries. Some of them you'll probably guess, China, India. Some of them perhaps you won't be so surprised at. The key point is that these countries produce 70% of the total global emissions from the Earth. So that means that the other 187 countries that there are only contributing 30%. Now, I think that tells us straight away, if these countries don't get a grip on their climate change activities, then we're all going to be in trouble. It's these countries which are causing the problems. Now, one of the problems is that 4 of them, of course, are major oil producers. And we probably remember the scandal in the last COP summit where the chairman was pouring school on the importance of stopping to use fossil fuels. So these countries are 70% of the emissions. The same countries, if we look at how sufficient has been their actions on climate change, well, this Source Climate Action Tracker maps a lot of things about countries, and this is their latest assessments of these 10 countries, and you can see they vary from insufficient through highly sufficient to critically insufficient in some cases. So they're not very well prepared to deal with climate change, and they're the ones producing 70% of the emissions. If we look at the countries' barriers to cooperation, I've grouped them together and say, well, look, we look at the first one, we've got the US, Germany, and Canada. against Russia in relation to the Ukraine war. We've got the sort of conflicts or the tensions between Russia and China, between the US and China. India versus China has a history of military conflict. I think the last conflict was about 2 years ago. Iran versus Saudi Arabia has conflicts concerning Shia and Sunni Islam. Japan versus China, tensions going back to Japanese activities in China during the Second World War. So we have a number of conflicts and tensions and histories about all of these top 10 countries. So we've got to ask the question, will these countries really cooperate on climate change? I think that's a very important question. I don't see it happening very much. Now, I just wanted to list something which you may or may not have come across before. It's something called the prisoner's dilemma. And it's about whether people cooperate or not. It's an aspect of game theory about how and why people cooperate or compete with one another. And according to prisoner's dilemma, rational individuals might not cooperate, even though it'd be better for them to do so, even though it'd be in their combined best interest to do so. They decide not to cooperate. And they do that by prioritizing their personal interests with individuals acting rationally can create a worse overall result. And the key question is, how much trust exists between these parties? Now, the term prisoner's dilemma came from this example. Imagine two bank robbers have been arrested and are being interrogated in separate rooms. The police have no other witnesses, and they can only prove the case if one of the arrested ones betrays the other one and testifies to the crime. Each bank robber is faced with the choice of cooperating with their accomplice and keeping quiet, or testifying for the prosecution. Now, the options are these. If they both cooperate and remain silent, they'll both get a year in prison for a lesser charge. They stick together. If one testifies and the other doesn't, the one who testifies will go free and the other one will get 5 years in jail. However, if they both testify against each other, each will get 3 years in jail for being partly responsible for the robber. So they're both in this situation wondering what to do. Shall I split on my colleague and tell the police, or shall we stick together? And the key question is, how much trust is there between the robbers? That's the prisoner's dilemma. Now, I put this up because I asked the question, in the light of what we said about these 10 countries, can the prisoner's dilemma be applied to countries in relation to climate change? Are countries really going to collaborate in an effective manner? And I would suggest that many countries have or will backside on their climate change commitments. We're doing it in the UK now. We started to drill for new oil. They've been doing it in Germany. So I think it's a big question as to what extent these countries are going to cooperate together. And I don't see it being very much. So that leaves me with the conclusion, some outcomes, which I think underpin all of this, that the world is very unlikely to achieve net zero GHG emissions by 2050. And I think more and more people are accepting that now. We will not contain temperatures to 1.5 degrees. They may rise towards 2 and even go beyond. There are scenarios that have been produced showing what will happen if temperatures go to 2.5, 3 and beyond. Major climate changes, floods, storms, heat waves, etc., but variances across the globe. Now, I was saying just now in rich countries and developed countries, I suspect because of the consequences of ongoing climate change, life will become difficult and uncomfortable. For many of us, traditional habits, lifestyles may change. We'll probably survive. We might not like it, but we'll probably survive. It might be uncomfortable. When we come to poorer countries, I just suggest it may be catastrophic. And I'll show something like that in a minute. And one aspect of this that we can expect massive rise in attempts at migration to Europe from Africa and Asia and to North America from South America. We can be expecting migration to be about 10-fold, 20-fold, who knows, much, much greater. I just put up Somalia as an example of a country, and you can see it's a very poor country. It's got low life expectancy. Child mortality is quite high. In terms of climate greenhouse gases, it's one of the lowest emitters of greenhouse gases, 165 out of 197. It's one of the highest vulnerability to climate change, and it's not very ready for climate change either. Now, if you look at the little blue thing, we can see there are pictures of these sort of things already happening in Somalia, and the little blue table suggests all of these other things are going to happen to Somalia as well. And this could happen in a lot of other countries in Africa and Asia. And to be quite honest, I don't really know what the solution is to this. But if we come back now to climate change actions and associated costs, what are they? Well, you need to draw a distinction, first of all, between mitigation and adaptation. Mitigation is basically actions designed to either slow and ultimately stop global warming taking place. So it's preventative measures to stop global warming carrying on, to stop it from happening. And we've got things there like, transition to renewable energy, reforestation, carbon capture, extracting carbon from the atmosphere. There are projects to reduce methane emissions from the agricultural sector, these sorts of things. This is mitigation. Adaptation is actions designed to deal with the impacts of climate change. Climate change is going to take place. These are the things that are going to happen, and we have to do something about it. So you can see some examples there, which will require adaptation. The change of the climate will require repairs to bridges, public transport, these sorts of things. Coastal areas will be flooded. And I've mentioned some of these places in the UK. Obviously, in other parts of the world, it'd be even worse. Buildings damaged caused by high winds, high temperatures, flooding, heavy precipitation, power and water utilities, consequence of rain, all these sorts of things, displaced populations. And one I picked up particularly, what Jack suggested to me, is that the health needs of populations will increase because of the higher temperatures brought on by climate change. So that's mitigation, actions designed to slow climate change, which we've been doing to some degree. Adaptation is how we deal with the consequences in the years ahead. Now, what are the costs? Well, I did a bit of research and I broke this down into the public sector and the private sector. Now, the public sector in 2023, we spent 7.7 billion on climate change mitigation in the UK. We also provided international assistance of 11.6 million over a 5-year period internationally. So that's historically the sort of figures taking place. So fairly significant sums there. And future spend, this isn't publicly available at the moment in a single source. Spending spread out over various departments. The private sector, there's no firm data available, and the problem is that many companies take actions which can be seen as helping the climate, but they're not really done for that necessarily. Things like energy conservation, companies could invest in that. It'll have a climate implication, but they've probably done it to reduce their cost base in the company. The private sector is encouraged to spend more on mitigation, and it does have some benefits to them. But as cost savings, as just described, it improves customer perceptions of the company. More and more customers are becoming discriminatory about which companies they're going to deal with, and they're looking for companies which have a better green profile, so it has an advantage there. And of course, it does bring a contribution to global climate change. So that's mitigation. That's what we've been doing. When we come to adaptation, well, I found a few sources here. Now, I think we've got to put a health warning here, first of all. These sources are making projections of adaptation expenditure from a very sort of limited set of evidence, really. I think if you think about it, if a building has been damaged by a storm, then the engineers can probably make a reasonable guess about, how much it's going to cost to repair the building, that sort of thing. But what the engineers don't know at the moment is how many storms there are going to be, how strong they're going to be, and in what parts of the world, what part of the country going to be. So some very difficulty in making some, hard estimates here. But the European Environment Agency suggested these figures that adaptation in Europe, and it's, in this case, they're including the UK in Europe, we're looking at 40 billion a year for a 1.5 degree, 5 billion euros, sorry, for a 1.5 degree rise in temperature. And if the temperature rises to 2 degrees, we're looking in the range 80 to 120 billion annually. So quite big figures. And I would reckon, I looked at the population and the GDP of the countries in Europe. The UK share of that would probably be about 10 to 15%, those sorts of figures. So quite substantial sums of money, adaptation, each year. An organization called COAC, it's in my notes at the end. I can't remember what COAC stands for. It's a sort of a network of people, technical experts, who have done a lot of detailed calculation about the cost of adaptation, cost of climate change, and they reckon it could come out to around 1% of GDP. And they've done quite a lot of detailed work in it. So there you're looking at a figure of about 20 to 25 billion a year climate change adaptation in the UK. The UKCC, which is the United Kingdom Climate Change Committee, they did some estimates, and they suggested initially adaptation costs in the UK could be 10 billion a year this decade, and rising significantly later on. So you're getting a feel here for the sorts of funds we're talking about. Now, we could say, well, these numbers, in the context of overall public expenditure in the UK of something like 1.1 trillion pounds, they're not huge amount of money. But on the other hand, if you look at them, some of them are quite large. Some of them are larger than the cost of some government programs at the current time. If we try to summarize this, then I think we can say there will still be substantial sums in the UK associated with mitigation of climate change. We assume government will still put money into mitigation, though will it be as great as in the past, given we've got this point that unless those top 10 polluting countries improve what they're doing, it's not really going to make much difference to the climate what we do in the UK. It's going to be a small drop in the ocean. But even so, there's a lot of political and moral imperative to do so. So there will still be substantial sums associated with mitigation, I suggest. Now, adaptation, while there isn't a significant definitive cost, from what I've put up previously, I would suggest that it's probably going to be of the order of several tens of billions of pounds per annum, those sorts of figures, 10, 20, 30 billion pounds per annum, carrying on. That seems to be the sort of figures we are talking about. Again, quite substantial amounts of money. And there's a key rider to this, that these amounts may increase substantially in later years. As time goes on, they will probably increase, but also as global temperatures continue to rise, they will increase. So if the temperature goes up to 1.5 and then 2 and 2.5, these adaptation costs are likely to increase. So they could become much larger than what I've already suggested. And of course, these figures could be a combination of private and public sector. Now, how might we pay for amounts of this type? As we say, they're not huge in the context of 1.1 trillion, but we really have to think how we pay for them. Now, if we look at the current pressures on public expenditure, these are quite well known. We already have high levels of public debt in the UK and other developed countries as well. Some would say it's unsustainable public debt. We have limited economic growth. We have to see what the political parties do, whatever the result of the election, but it doesn't seem to be we're going to have buoyant economic growth. Also worth noting that I haven't touched on this in Conte, but adaptation, there are also implications for economic growth. To give you an example, I live in Wales. You will know that in Wales there are 2 bridges over the Severn Channel, and one was opened in 1966, the other one was opened in 1996. Those are absolutely critical to the economy of Wales and the economy of other parts of the UK. If those bridges were disrupted in some way because of climate activities and they required repair, that would have a huge impact on the GDP of Wales and other parts of the UK. And I mean, the old bridge, the 1966 one is often closed even today. If there are high winds, they often have to close it for repairs. So if you could see in the future that we had really big storms, those could have an impact on the economic outgrowth of the country. We have the pressures of the aging population in terms of cost of health, social care, and the fact and economic implications because of the size of the labour force. We know there are pressures on the defence budget because of what's happening in the world, in Ukraine and Gaza and all the places. I would suggest there's also issues around health protection. We had the COVID pandemic. Public health people often suggest that the situation is such that we could well have more pandemics again, which may well require resources. And obviously we know there are other things like education and the health service and all these sorts of things. Informal migration, I think that's about 3 billion a year that's costing. And we've got the costs of climate change, adaptation and mitigation. So we already got huge pressures on public expenditure, and this cost of adaptation is coming on top of that. Now, how might we pay for it? Well, the old chestnut, we could think about switching from a current public expenditure program and putting more money into climate change adaptation. Doesn't seem to be much scope there. Higher levels of general taxation in the country. Well, it seems to me from what I've seen on the television and reading, most of the political leaders at the moment are telling us what they're not going to increase. The taxes they're definitely not going to increase. I mean, there are a few. Labour's tax on VAT tax on public schools is one, but most of the time they're telling us they're not going to increase taxes. In fact, they're talking about reducing them. Could we think about a hypothecated, a dedicated climate change tax? This has often been talked about in the health sector, whereby we get away from the current method of funding the health service and general taxation, and we have a health-specific tax, which goes towards running the health service. And there's a belief that is more people are more open to that sort of tax than they are to higher levels of general taxation. Could we have that equivalent for climate change tax? Could we adopt some sort of private finance schemes where we use private sector funding for public expenditure purposes for adaptation? Now, I was involved in the 90s onwards in a number of private finance projects in different sectors. And I guess we might say is the jury is out on how successful they were. But again, it might be possible to think about some sort of private finance schemes. And lastly, could we think about setting up some form of state-owned investment fund? Now, we know that some countries like Norway have what they call a sovereign wealth fund, and they put revenues into that fund. We do have such a fund in the UK, of course, a national insurance fund, where the money is not available for, it's limited in the ways in which the money can be used. So we could think about setting up some sort of fund whereby we start building the fund up when we use that fund to meet the significant costs of climate change adaptation in the future. In the private sector, well, companies, again, depending on the company, some of them could face quite significant costs of adaptation as a consequence of climate change. They could just pay as they go, deal with the costs out of annual profits, but the expenditure may be a bit lumpy, and they might not want to do that. They might think that they can rely on insuring themselves against the risks of climate change damage. But what I've found is that at the moment, there are quite low levels of cover for climate change events. Only about 25% of potential climate change events are covered by insurance. And it's expected that a growth in risk and a growth in claims will force up premiums, possibly to a point where it becomes unaffordable or unavailable. Insurance companies just say we can't do it, can't provide insurance for that. Difficulties in pricing, and companies may provide some sort of incentives to encourage companies to be more climate focused. But insurance may not be an option. So again, might companies do the same? Might they start setting up a corporate climate fund where they start putting reserves aside to meet what are likely to be significant costs of adaptation in the future? Now, I'd just like to leave with a couple of questions and responses. And the first one is, can we avoid incurring future expenditure on climate change adaptation? Well, I think unless something changes radically, I don't think we can assume that. I think we are well past that now. There is sufficient global warming, sufficient climate change to recognize we are likely to be incurring quite a bit of climate change adaptation expenditure in the future. So the answer must be no. Should we reduce, very controversial one, should we reduce ongoing expenditure on climate change mitigation? Let's go back to the 10 countries who provide 70% of the global gas emissions, who don't seem to be doing too much about dealing with it, even though they claim they are. They're not very well prepared and not likely to cooperate very much. So are we wasting money on climate change mitigation when we know that it's not going to have any effect because it all depends on these 10 polluting countries? I just put that's debatable. I think that's a very controversial issue. A lot of people will feel very, very strongly about that. But I think there are examples of governments doing this already, recognizing that with certain things we're going to do and certain things we're not going to do because we don't think we're going to get, it's not going to help us at all. Can we afford to incur expenditure on both large amounts of mitigation and large amount of adaptation? Well, we've seen the sort of levels of cost involved in each case. And again, I would just put that as question mark, question mark, question mark. I don't know. It depends what we do about funding these things, how we find the money to fund these things. So that's all I wanted to talk about now. So hope you found it interesting. If you have any questions, or comments, or suggestions, please throw them out. I certainly don't claim to have all the answers, but I did want to try and promote a debate on these particular issues. And so I'll stop there, Jack. That's okay.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Malcolm. Very thought-provoking presentation, and we've had quite a few comments and questions raised in the Q&A. So I'm going to just go back to the countries, as you say, the top polluters. One of the comments that we've had in, which I welcome your reflection on, is this idea of kind of almost blaming them for being top polluters when in fact they're sort of supplying most of the products that we seem to want to consume. Where do we go with that?
Well, I think Jack, in my book, I've written one of the main causes of climate change is, of course, overconsumption. That's absolutely right. I mean, the one I like to quote, for example, is fast fashion, which is reckoned to be 10% of greenhouse gas emissions. So it's absolutely right in that case. But the reality is that they are producing those things at the moment, and they are incurring these emissions. Let's see. I would entirely agree with you that we should cut our habits, our spending habits, buy less, but there'd be huge economic implications of that as well, of course. But all I'm doing is quoting. I'm not making a moral judgment. I'm just quoting the reality that China, of course, will say, well, okay, we're producing emissions, but you started it, America. You've been doing it for decades, centuries almost. Right? So why blame us? But that's the reality.
Yeah,
they are the top 10 polluters.
And in that context, I guess we're now entering this global. You suggested, and I think you're probably not wrong, that we're entering a global conflict about resources. And one of our questioners is, how is this likely to be addressed in future political discourse? Because it doesn't seem to be mentioned in the arguments about, migration, the arguments about who should take the share in terms of mitigation and adaptation roles. This fighting over the resources, it's your prisoner's dilemma. So how can we really address that in future political discourse?
Well, the term often used is that we want better global governance. And, that applies not just to climate change, it applies to warfare, it applies to the economy, it applies to taxation. And clearly what we want is some form of global governance. But it's such a naive thing to say because we're light years away from it, aren't we?
Yeah. And if anything, we're kind of moving away from
that
globalization,
we're moving away from it.
We're
moving away from it. Yeah. So I don't have the solution there, I'm afraid. But that is the solution. But how we get from where we are now to where we need to be, when, as you say, we're actually going in the opposite direction at the moment.
So good case for globalization. So what about, it's a question from me, what about the role of the, organizations that, you and I are both involved with in one way or another, the World Bank, the WHO, the big, international agencies that are driving these agendas. Do you see them as providing that global glue?
Well, again, they have limited scope at the end of the day. There's only so much they can do. I mean, they must do more. I mean, if I go off for a second, I mean, to show the problem here, the last COP summit, if I remember rightly, the countries set aside £500 million for climate change adaptation in developing countries. And I thought, that's the size of my local authority.
Yeah.
That's supposed to be for all the developing countries in the world. So it's just a drop in the ocean, isn't it? It probably needs 500 billion, not 500 million. And I would guess, more than I do, the institutions don't have that sort of amounts to deal with that. They don't have enough resources. They don't have that push. Yeah.
So one of the questioners has raised a slightly more local issue, which is, during this, we're hearing this election that we didn't anticipate when we booked this webinar, but here we are. And there's lots of discussion about, Great British Energy or, other, whether we should be sort of have a be pragmatic, I think is the word, about our climate change targets, but also, very things like home insulation and sort of things that we feel are very sensible solutions, but are they going to be enough? Is it enough just to start insulating our homes and use a few more windmills?
Well, no, they're not. That's I keep coming back to consumption. We've only got to look at the relative consumption of developed countries compared to the developing countries. It's massive. And we look at things like food. How much food we waste in developed countries. Fast fashion is another one. We just massively overconsume and we use up the Earth's resources. And I don't want to try and make a political point here, but that's encouraged by a capitalist system which requires growth to be sustainable.
Putting on your devil's advocate hat, is there a capitalist solution to this? Is there some way in which it can be, if it's seen to be a commercial, to be a commercial advantage to invest in mitigation or adaptation by the private sector? Do you think that's a potential way out? When it
Well,
becomes seen to become more profitable to build carbon capture machines, do you think that could be the savior of us?
Well, you picked on there about, if I can pick on that, about technological solutions. I mean, that's often put about that. We'll get out of this. There'll be technological developments which will solve it. And it struck me. I remember reading somewhere once about when the Americans were first looking to put a man on the moon. They ran a sort of competition about different people's ideas about different ways of doing it. And somebody suggested that what we should do is you should send the person who's going to be a man. We send the man to the moon and we give him 3 years amount of food so that he can survive. And in the 3 years, we find a way of getting him back. Now, didn't like the sound of that myself, but I think we're doing a bit of that now. We're thinking to ourselves, well, if we can solve the dilemma of peaceful nuclear fusion, we can get peaceful energy from nuclear fusion. That would solve the problem. We have unlimited energy. The problem is, I was reading about nuclear fusion, peaceful nuclear fusion, when I was in primary school, and we've at the very best, we are decades away from nuclear fusion. So carbon capture is the same. There are huge economic problems in making carbon capture economic, and even then, we're not certain that the carbon will stay what it should be anyway. So, another one is about climate engineering, which is a bit risky. We're taking chances of these things. So, I think it's very dangerous to rely on technological solutions to this problem in case they don't come along, and then we're really in trouble.
So we've had a couple more questions come in. One of them I'm going to actually read out. So thanks, Malcolm. The EU elections show a rise of the right, and the world seems dominated by powerful narcissists. Both seem to focus on short-term issues and, for example, building walls to prevent migration, rather than addressing climate change and poverty as the drivers of migration. Yep. Does this not suggest a dire future? That's not to encourage you to be prophet of doom, but can we address global warming in this political climate? And it's right across Europe.
Yeah. Well, I suppose the short answer is no, but I mean the migration one is interesting because I touched on, we're seeing this shift to the right in Europe now on current levels of migration. It's difficult to get people to understand, I think, the scale of migration is going to be in the future when you get all this desertification of land and drought and what have you. I don't know I think I told you the other day, Jackie, somebody suggested, I don't know how much weight we should put on this, but every degree rise in temperature will result in 1 billion people trying to migrate to a new area. 1 billion people trying to migrate. Yeah. Now, you can imagine, that would dwarf the figures we've got on migration at the moment. And that's another thing about adaptation, you see, is where even if we could bring all these people to Europe, where would we put them? We'd have to have huge building projects to house them. Even if they stayed in North Africa, they'd have to have huge amounts for them to accommodation. So,
yeah, it's a difficult one. It goes back to that prisoner's dilemma again, doesn't it?
Yeah.
We're all kind of putting a barrier around our own little islands, one way or another.
Yeah.
It's been mentioned in the Q&A, if well spent. Well, actually, two things have been questioned in the Q&A. One is there more we could be doing to finance or look at options for financing mitigation actions? And then the other question is, there's some evidence that, in a small way where they've been piloted, adaptation initiatives can, generate savings of, multiple times of the investment in terms of carbon emission. How can that be scaled in practice? What are the barriers of scaling that in practice? Two separate questions, but
the second one about adaptation sort of paying for themselves, really, I think that is true, but it still doesn't solve the problem of where we get the money from in the first place. Because I think we know, Jack, that in many parts of the public sector, we can always come up with projects which will generate good value for money.
Just can't afford
but we can't get the cash. And that still applies today. The money have to come from somewhere, really. That's the problem there. Yeah.
But what about financing mitigation actions?
Well, I'm not sure what we're thinking about private or public here, but one thing I've been talking to business people about is that quite often they're very risk averse in making investments, and perhaps if they can become a bit less risk averse, bit less risk averse, that's right, and think about savings in the longer term, they might see some of the projects which they wouldn't do at the moment might become viable. It's a matter of having a different approach to risk, I think, on investments.
So maybe that could be a role of government in our capitalist
Could be,
society.
yeah, it could be, yeah, to encourage them to think that way, yeah, and see the advantage. Well, I'm doing some work with a colleague at the moment with the business community, trying to get them to see the advantages to the business of investing in climate change issues, not because it's a good thing, but appealing to their worst interest, if you like, is saying it'll really be good for the business.
Yes,
really be good
that's what I suppose that's where I was going earlier on with. Is there a commercial driver that we could, which I think is, perhaps where some of our politicians are heading.
We know that a lot of consumers now are looking to work with, buy from companies who've got a green profile. Now, sometimes we got to be careful because that green profile is a bit false, and it's all PR, and but those sorts of things.
Yeah. We've got another question come in. As living conditions get worse and worse, will there come a point when the public, or enough of us, put enough pressure on governments to really take these difficult actions needed to stop temperatures rising further? Is there some optimism there somewhere in your mind?
The problem is it's too late, because one thing we have to understand is that emissions are still rising. Mm-hmm. They're still rising. We're supposed to be bringing them back down by 2050, but at the moment they're still rising. There's talk of them plateauing out in about 2027. May or may not happen, but the temperature's not going to go down. It could take 1,000 years for those temperatures to drop back to the levels they are at the moment. So we're just going to have to live with it.
Yeah,
I think that was my point. In developed countries, we might have air conditioning with renewable power, and we might have to restrict our travel habits and fly less and these sorts of things, but we'll survive. But the developing countries, I think it's absolutely horrendous. Absolutely horrendous.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really true. I mean, one of the reflections I had of your first edition of your book was perhaps understating the health impacts of climate change. I'd welcome your thoughts on that. I mean, there's two kind of vulnerabilities, aren't there? Exposures. Yeah. One is the sort of shock events of floods and epidemics and all of those kinds of things. Earthquakes, droughts. We saw your pictures of Somalia, but there's also the sort of long-term stressor of, it's just generally warmer, so you get mosquitoes and coming into England, for example, with malaria and various vector-borne diseases. You get waterborne diseases becoming quite common because our infrastructure can't cope with the amount of rain we have.
And I think we're only finding that out as we go along, aren't we? We don't know what's going to happen. These things are happening now, Yeah.
But in low to middle income countries, the impacts could be, given that they don't have resilient health systems, the impacts could be really catastrophic. I'd welcome your thoughts on that.
Yeah, and one thing that worries me is, we had the COVID pandemic, and obviously viruses don't respect borders. they go where they want to go, and those poor countries will not have robust procedures in place to contain spread of the disease. So it's going to affect us at the end of the day. If it infects developing countries, it'll inevitably spread to us. So it's in our interest to help them have robust health systems, but very difficult to get that across to people.
So one last question, and then we need to wrap up. What do you think about carbon taxes as a possible source of global tax?
I'm not sure if this means on corporations or on individuals. Was it
either?
Come back. Either. Either. Well, I think
it'll fall on individuals, even if it goes through the corporations, won't it?
Yeah, sure, yeah. But I keep coming back to the point that consumption levels, are just excessive in the Western world, and any sort of taxation which would reduce that would be beneficial. But you see, I'm always a little bit worried. I get the example of take myself. I only buy a new mobile phone when it stops working or I've lost it. But of course, people are encouraged, aren't they, to buy the next new model, the next new model, next new model. So anything that would stop that, I think, would be beneficial. Yeah, yeah,
yeah. Well, I certainly myself
it would raise some revenue as well, of course.
trying to manage my wardrobe better. She says.
Yeah, I know the feeling. Fast fashion.
Thank you, Malcolm. That
Okay.
has been a really topical and interesting discussion and presentation. Thank
Good.
you, everyone, for your attendance and support, especially during a busy election period. We're releasing our schedule of events for the next academic year shortly, so do keep an eye on the website, sign up to receive updates. The other thing is, in the meantime, talking about the election, we're developing analysis of the main economic policies coming out of the election campaign through our electionomics blog, and I'm very pleased myself I was able to say that. I've been practicing. We just published articles analysing the triple lock plus and proposals to stop interest payments on reserves held at the Bank of England. And so those are very interesting, and there'll be more to come. Please follow our social media accounts, sign up to receive the newsletter, and you'll be able to enjoy those as well. Finally, you'll all be aware our primary concern at the ERC is the promotion of economic education and economic literacy. So we're going to be releasing a policy paper shortly focusing on how we can improve economic education in secondary schools. And you'll be notified of this as well if you're on our mailing list or follow our social media platforms. So on that note, thank you all very much, and hopefully we'll see you again at one of the next webinars. Take care and have a good evening.